Okay, so hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar discussion today called From Data to Design, a step-by-step guide to producing an infographic and jumping the hurdles along the way. My name is Gina Lucarelli. I'm the team leader of Knowledge and Innovation here at the UN Development Coordination Office. We are the secretariat to the UN Development Group, which is all the UN agencies working on development operations on the ground. We've got on the line several colleagues from across the UN system and across the world, and we're really thrilled to have two colleagues from the Overseas Development Institute with us today to walk us through their experience producing infographics as one tool for data visualization. So let me just introduce our presenters, and then I'll hand over. So we have Katie Harris, who is the Communication Manager of Development Progress. Development Progress, if you haven't seen it, you should check it out. It's a very interesting platform of ODI where they focus on measuring, understanding, and communicating how and where development progress has been made. She's joined by Pia Dawson, who's the digital editor for the Overseas Development Institute, and together they have produced over 35 infographics at ODI, and it's not just the quantity, they're also exceptionally good infographics. They're very compelling, simplifying complex issues and getting a reaction. So we're really excited to focus on this side of the data revolution, not so much the collection and the analysis of data, but really moving towards the use of data for decision making. So over to you, Katie and Pia, and we'll look forward to you walking us through your presentation. For colleagues on the line, if you do have questions, put them in the questions box, and we will moderate a Q&A along the way, but more fully when Katie and Pia finish their presentation. So Katie and Pia, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Gina, and thanks for everyone who's listening today. And we look forward to having a really fruitful discussion over the next hour and a half about infographics and some of the challenges along the way of producing an infographic. And I think we just want to start off by saying we're not claiming to be experts in this process. We're very much working by trial and error here at ODI. It's something that we've really started producing from hardly having any infographics at all a couple of years ago to producing about an infographic a month, if not more, over the last couple of years. And it's been a challenging process for us, one that has led to lots of rewards. But we really wanted to share how we've gone about this process, the journey that we've taken from producing an infographic, and some of the difficulties that we go through and the conversations that we have internally along the way, in the hope that by sharing those, we can together make the process a little bit easier for everyone. So I'm going to start just by telling you a little bit more about Development Progress as a project, because that will hopefully contextualize some of the infographics we've produced and also give you a bit more of an idea about why we've produced them and the audiences that we've been aiming to reach through them. So ODI is an independent think tank. We focus on international development and humanitarian issues. And Development Progress is a flagship project at the Institute. It's been running for about the last 4 years, this phase of the project, and it's really trying to answer that big question, what is working and why in international development? Which countries are really making great strides forward across different areas of development? We explore health and education, we're looking at political voice, we're looking at women's empowerment, all kinds of different issues, but really trying to ask the question, what progress has been made across different countries in the last 20 years? Crucially, what are the drivers of that progress? And what are the challenges, but also the lessons that we can learn from that? And we have a series of audiences that we're trying to reach. So we've divided these into 3 groups. The first group are what we call the movers and shakers. And these are the folks, the policymakers, the decision makers who are really driving the global development agenda. These are ODI's bread and butter audiences, if you like. These are the people that we've been trying to reach, trying to target from the very outset. The second and third groups are groups more particular to the Development Progress Project. So our main research for the project is producing a series of case studies. By the end of the project later this year, we'll have produced approaching 50 case studies of different countries that have really made progress in these different sectors of development. So we're really aiming to reach policymakers within those case study countries themselves, those kind of sector and finance specialists who are driving the progress that we are seeing. But we're also aiming to reach out to a group that we're calling the raconteurs, the storytellers, those groups such as the media and the big charities like Oxfam and Save the Children and others who are telling stories of development, who are shaping citizens' views about what development is and where it's happening and why. So these are the three groups that we've been trying to reach through our research. And I'm just going to move on to just say infographics are one part of a huge suite of sort of communication tools that we're using to try and communicate our research to these groups. So we're producing animations, we've just done a big participatory photography project, we're investing quite a lot in films and blogs and all sorts of things. But I think infographics are really key, and I'm just going to go back to those audience groups for reaching all three of them. They're really key for both the movers and shakers and our country catalysts, because these are not the sort of people who are going to pick up and read from cover to cover a 60-page report about, for instance, how Nepal has halved its maternal mortality rate. You know, even if they are experts in that particular sector, they just don't have the time. And what infographics can really deliver to these groups is a real kind of synthesis of the key messages and the key findings of a report that we can convey within a minute or two of their time. So they're excellent at reaching those two groups with the real key findings, the nuggets of our case study findings. They're also really great for reaching our raconteurs, because you don't have to be an expert to understand our infographics. They're designed to be understood by people with relatively little or no understanding or prior experience of that sector. So it allows us to communicate the findings of some really dense, technical, complex research reports into these kind of bite-sized chunks that the general public and the media can share much more easily. So infographics really help us reach all three of those groups.
Yeah, and I just wanted to chip in there as well and say that a lot of the time there's often a perception, particularly amongst maybe researchers that we're working with, that infographics, because they involve a kind of simplification sometimes, or a shorter, less nuanced way of getting a message out, that it's not really suitable for those kind of policymaker audiences and decision maker audiences. But actually what we found has kind of been the opposite of that, and we've had really good responses from precisely those audiences. So there's good ammunition there if people are not sure that infographics are the way to go to convey, an important policy message or something. That we've found in our experience that it definitely is.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a bit of background to how infographics kind of fit within the bigger picture of our communication tools and activities. We're going to spend the next kind of half an hour or so just really walking you through the process that we go through to produce an infographic, right from that first idea that we have to the final output at the end, and talk you through some of the hurdles that we have to jump along the way, some of the trade-offs that we have to make. So I just want to be clear, first of all, about the sorts of infographics that I'm talking about, because there's a huge array of different types of data visualizations and infographics out there. I could spend the next sort of 24 hours just talking about what is an infographic versus a data visualization. But just to be clear, the infographics that we tend to produce in development progress are these kind of static infographics that have a really clear narrative to convey, and that narrative is formed through our kind of research, through our broader research. We have less experience in producing the more kind of interactive graphics that might sit online and allow people to manipulate the data and kind of find their own stories and findings from it. And so ODI more broadly has a bit more experience at the latter.
Yeah, so within ODI, it's not something that we do routinely, because obviously doing something that's interactive or animated, there's always higher costs associated with that. But we do have a couple of our programs who have done stuff with a tool called Tableau, which some of you might have come across, and I think it's free to use, at least in its kind of basic version. And so we have a website, for example, with the Climate Fund Update, which has used Tableau to sort of display data sets and allow users to manipulate those and kind of produce their own views. And we've just released something today as well, which is a Sustainable Development Goals target tracker, and that's been produced within Tableau as well. So it's something that I think, yeah, has been identified as a tool for doing that kind of thing. But yeah, as I said, we are yet to do more of the kind of experimental stuff with producing and commissioning our own animated infographics.
Yeah, but we'd be really keen if anybody on the line has more experience of that to hear about your views, maybe at the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of these sorts of infographics. The one that you can see on your screen at the moment is an infographic we produced to accompany our case study on Tunisia, looking at the progress the country has made over the last 20 to 30 years on improving women's equality. So you can see the left-hand side graphic shows the progress the country has made in enrolling girls in secondary school between 1980 and 2011. The graphic on the right is a comparative infographic showing how many judges in Tunisia are female compared to male, and how this compares to both the US and the UK, which is quite favourable. And then the graphic at the bottom shows the increasing numbers of women who are being elected to the Tunisian parliament. And these three infographics sit together in the case study report, but we've divided them up separately for social media purposes. So we sent different tweets to showcase the graphic on education versus the graphic on the Tunisian parliament, for instance. And then just to give you another example on a completely different topic, these are some infographics that we produced to accompany a report on access to energy in Vietnam. The top infographic shows the absolutely staggering achievements the country has made in terms of providing its population with access to electricity, going from just 14% of the population in 1990 to pretty much universal coverage in 2010. And the graphic on the bottom shows how Vietnam has maintained a high proportion of its energy from renewable sources. There's quite a lot of critique in the actual report that Vietnam had increased the proportion of fossil fuels in its energy mix to enable it to expand access so rapidly. But we really wanted to show that actually in comparison to other country brackets and to its neighbouring countries, it's actually still performing really strongly in terms of its renewable energy mix. So those are just a couple examples of the sorts of infographics that we produce. Okay, so the very first step that we go through to produce an infographic is to decide what we want the infographic to achieve. And this really varies for each case study. So I've pulled out some examples here of the sorts of kind of aims and objectives that we might choose, but it's by no means an exhaustive or comprehensive list. These are just a few examples. But sometimes we might decide to produce an infographic to pull out, you know, the really headline finding, the really key fact, to enable viewers to understand it at a glance. Sometimes it will be more a case of highlighting unusual statistics or findings within the case study that might be kind of buried within pages and pages of text, with the idea being to kind of trying to stimulate a bit of debate, a bit of discussion in the wider community on those topics. We might choose to produce an infographic to draw out a comparison to help the reader sort of contextualize and understand the information and put it into perspective. We might show readers, we might produce an infographic to show readers the flow and the order of information. So sometimes our case studies will spend 20 to 30 pages trying to explain the particular drivers or causes of progress in a country, and we can highlight some of the main findings through a narrative-based infographic and convey that to a reader in just a few seconds. So sometimes that can be beneficial. And sometimes it's just simply to help readers understand quite dense and complex information and make it easier for viewers to share and digest and therefore really extend the reach of the research. And I'm just going to take you through examples of infographics that we produced to with those purposes in mind. Okay, so first infographic, trying to convey a headline story at a glance. This was an infographic that we produced to accompany our case study on Brazil, and again, like Vietnam, it was on access to energy. And we really wanted to convey to readers just how huge Brazil's challenge was in bringing electricity to its citizens. This was a concept that actually we can't claim credit for. We didn't come up with it ourselves. We found it buried in a report that was in a policy document produced by an agency in Brazil. And it overlays the national electricity grid in Brazil over a map of Europe. So you can really see immediately just how vast the grid is, and just what a challenge Brazil had in extending access to all corners of the country. So that's an example of an infographic that we felt really communicated that particular research point in one glance. Secondly, to convey an unusual fact or finding. This is an infographic we produced in a booklet that we wrote, which was focusing on political voice and what political voice was, how you can channel it as a citizen, how we measure it, what drives political voice forwards, and so forth. And within this, we drew on some research that was that was found in another paper by the primary author of this report, looking at sort of the fact that often we assume, as think tanks and other research institutes, that democracy is going to be an important tool for political voice. But actually, when you go out and survey the population, it may not be that political entities like parties or institutions like parliaments are what people trust. And in this particular survey, we had found that within the respondents, 61% of people said the institution they trusted first and foremost was the army. And we found that really surprising, and you can see political parties are much lower down the scale at 30%. So we produced this infographic to really highlight that main finding of this particular survey. The third example, an infographic to show a comparison or a contextualization. This was an infographic we produced for a report that just came out looking at development finance, and we wanted to, one of the findings of the report was on the amount that it would cost to deliver secondary education to all the world's developing countries. And we really wanted to put that amount into perspective, because $32 billion per year sounds like a lot when you say it, just as a figure. So we compared it to the globe's military spending and found that it was actually less than a single week's global military spending. So again, this helps readers contextualize information that they might otherwise not be able to kind of fully grasp. Okay, the fourth example of some infographics this time showing causality and process. The infographic on the left is showcasing the improvements that Mozambique have made to maternal health care and the different drivers that have led to its reduction in maternal mortality. So it highlights particular drivers such as professionals attending antenatal visits, the number of people per health centre and how that has declined since 1997, and how the number of health facilities have increased. All factors that have led to and contributed to Mozambique's improvements in its maternal mortality rate. The infographic on the right is another infographic we produced for our Brazil report. The left-hand side process shows how Brazil currently plans and decides where to and whether to build its large hydropower dams that obviously have big impacts for the local environment and local communities. The right-hand side of the column is an alternative process that the researcher of this particular report laid out around how it could work better in the future to better consult communities, not only on the placement of those dams, but on whether in fact those dams should be built in the first place, or whether Brazil should be getting its energy needs from elsewhere. So those are just a couple of very different examples, but each sort of laying out and showing different processes or causal inferences. Finally, sometimes, as I said, we'll produce an infographic to try and share and extend the reach of our research to new audience groups. This is an example of an infographic that we produced specifically really for social media, highlighting the gaps in data and the fact that there are very few countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have data on income poverty trends. So that was an example of an infographic we produced for social media. Okay, so once we've sat down and figured out what actually we want the infographic to achieve, which normally takes the form of a meeting between the researchers of a particular report and communication staff, we will then look to information within our reports that would support the aim. So sometimes this can be, a data, a statistic, a number, but it can also be, as you've seen from the previous examples, more of a concept or a process or a map or a timeline. It doesn't necessarily have to be, an actual number. And then we tend to start this in one of two ways. So sometimes we will start with the data. We'll ask ourselves, do we have a credible, a comprehensive data set? What are the interesting patterns and trends within this data that we might want to illustrate? And then we will pull out the story that we want to tell from within that. Otherwise, sometimes we start with a narrative and ask ourselves, what do our target audience care about? What is the key message from the research that we might want to express in illustration, or that we think might resonate with the audience the most? And then we will look to see what data we have to support this.
And just on that point as well, if you do go with the second option and start with, the message that you're trying to convey and look for the data afterwards to support that, it's obviously very tempting if you're working in comms to I don't know, try and shape the data in a way that that fits your story better. And from experience, again, it's definitely really important to make sure that the researchers or the people who are involved in producing that data and writing the report are absolutely happy with how you're telling the story about that data before you go to the next phase of getting the designer to start working on the infographic itself, because it will save you a lot of time down the road. So just make sure that with that one, everybody's on board from the very outset.
Yeah, and this is where we come up against our next challenge. So sometimes there will be disagreements, and this picks up from what Pia had just said, disagreements on the best information or data to illustrate this particular message or story that we want to convey. This, you can see on the screen now, is an infographic we produced for a case study on political voice in Ghana, and we really wanted to show how high voter turnout is in Ghana in comparison to other countries. Myself and others in the communications team wanted to compare Ghana to other countries such as the UK and the US, who are well known as really established democracies, just to show how high Ghana is in comparison to even countries such as the UK and the US. And also because we knew that this is where a lot of our target audience are based on our respondents on social media, so we thought it would resonate more with them. Whereas the researchers involved were really keen to compare voter turnout in Ghana to other emerging democracies in Africa, as they felt that that was a more relevant comparison. Now, in the end, as you can see from this infographic, we ended up doing both. I will leave it up to you to judge whether it works. It perhaps might seem like a slightly random collection of different countries from the outset, but it meant that we could ultimately both achieve what we were hoping it would achieve. Okay, so related to this challenge is sort of getting staff with different forms of expertise and different skill sets to agree on a unified message. And these infographics I've just popped up on the screen are examples of ones we've actually only just released within the last couple of weeks. They're part of a broader set of infographics that ODI are increasingly doing called the 10 Things to Know. And I'll just let Pia explain what those are.
Yeah, so the 10 Things to Know sort of series has emerged as a kind of format that we're using again and again, always in slightly different ways. So we might have 10 things to know about the data revolution and development, like this one here. It might take more of the form of a briefing for policymakers. So we did a 10 priorities for the new EU Trade Commissioner, I think. Or it could be more of an explainer style of thing, like 10 things to know about evaluation. But we found that it's quite a successful format because obviously, for a start, everybody loves lists, and there's something inherently clickable about 10 things to know about something. But it also is quite a good way of packaging, you know, a set of data or a set of findings or recommendations in a kind of bite-sized thing, which is already sort of split up into different segments which you can share individually on social media. So that's the format.
Yeah. So I think to produce these infographics, there was possibly about 6, 7 people involved. Pia was involved because these infographics formed part of this larger set, these 10 Things to Know, and they have common design principles, and it was really important that these infographics were consistent with those other sets. I was involved in terms of thinking as a communications specialist, thinking about the target audience, thinking about how we were going to promote them and share them and distribute them. So I had my own lens through which I was reviewing the different drafts and commenting on them. We had a quantitative data researcher who was checking the accuracy of the figures and the comparisons and making sure that she was happy with them. We had a qualitative researcher commenting on them who wrote a broader report that we released around the same time on the data revolution, and she was keen to make sure that the messages of these infographics resonated and chimed with the messages of the broader report that she was doing. We had the actual designer, we had the head of program wanting to sign them off. So this just really highlights that it can be a challenge with so many staff looking at the same infographics through different lenses. But each of those was really necessary to produce these infographics and make sure that they were accurate and relevant and of a good quality. And I don't think there are any easy answers as to how you generate consensus across all the different opinions in that group, except that you just have to keep working at it, and all accept that you will probably have to compromise slightly along the way. Okay, so this brings me on to my third challenge area, which is the quality and integrity of the data that we're using. Often the data we're using is incomplete. It might be unreliable, it might be inaccurate, we might not have it consistently for every year within the time span that we're looking. And in a longer research report, this is easy to caveat. You just put a footnote, or you might, you know, if you really have serious concerns about the data, you might put it in a box and explain it and really nuance it. But on an infographic that chances are somebody's going to look at for a matter of seconds, you can't do that, and we ban footnotes from our infographics. So this can be a problem. If researchers are not 100% confident in the data, they might be reluctant to produce an infographic, even if it does support their overall findings and conclusions. And these are a couple of infographics that we produced which illustrate this very problem, the gaps in our data. The one on the left showing the fact that we just don't know how many people are living in extreme poverty, living on under $1.25 a day. And the one on the right showing the fact that we just don't know how many women are dying in childbirth, given issues with determining the maternity mortality rates. So this is something that you always have to watch out for.
And just another thing to add on the kind of quality and integrity of data. So in the previous example of the infographic where we had a comparison, so the findings of the report show that I can't remember, 32 billion I think would be needed to provide education for all per year, and then comparing that with the global military spending per week. So the first figure came out of our research, but the second figure is us in the comms team trying to find, a suitable comparison, something that will put it in context, and basically trawling around trying to find other sources of data to do that. And one thing that was sort of flagged is just the importance of, if you are going around looking for supplementary data or secondary sources of data, just to make sure that someone in the team is responsible for checking the integrity of that data. Because yeah, there have been instances where we realised at the very last minute that the source was a bit unreliable, and that's obviously led to delays and extra costs as we've had to make last-minute changes.
Yeah. Okay, and then on to the fourth challenge, which is agreeing the target audience for your infographic. So we're all agreed in development progress that the audience should be much broader than the case study, but the question is who are we trying to target with these infographics? We want them to be simpler. We want there to be no presumed knowledge. We want anybody to be able to look at the infographic and understand it. And we recognise that there's only going to be a very, very small group of people who are ever going to pick up one of our 50-page reports and read it from cover to cover. But it can be quite difficult at times to assess, other than all understanding that you want to reach more people through the infographic, just who those target audiences are. And even if you are in agreement about who you want to reach, it's not always straightforward to think how you will reach them. And so it really pays here to think through, before you've even started your designs of your infographics, to think through how you're going to disseminate them, how are you going to get them into the hands of the people that you're trying to inform or influence, and start thinking about that from an early stage. Okay, so after you've done all of that, after we've decided what our infographic is aiming to achieve, after we've found the data, the narrative, we've written our key messages, we know who we want it to be targeted at, we know how we're going to target, then we aim to sit down and write a design brief. And development progress as a project, we tend to work with a range of design agencies. We've built up a really trusted list of suppliers that we work with and who know us and our quirks, and we know them. ODI has gone down, as an institute, has gone down a different approach in that we've brought in a designer in-house because we decided it would be more cost effective and we could get kind of more consistent designs and for them to be on brand. But either way, whether you're going to a design agency or you're lucky enough to have somebody in-house, you'll need to be able to effectively communicate your needs. And this means writing a really tight design brief and specifying if there are any images in particular you want them to include. You might have had ideas along the way, or also avoid. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. And it's at this stage that we finalise that the specification, the format of the infographic that is most appropriate in liaison with the designer. And this is where we come up against our fifth challenge, which is that we want everybody who's contributed to the process so far and who will be responsible for reviewing and signing off the infographics to sign off on the brief, so that we can say we're all really clear on what we want these infographics to achieve and the key messages to convey. But of course, no one wants to commit to this approach until they've seen that it works. Everybody all suddenly becomes, you know, the biggest commitment phobe. And this means that quite often, much later down the line, once concepts have been developed, various different stakeholders will want to go back to the brief and to change it. So it's really, really important that as far as possible at this stage, everybody is clear that we need to stick to the brief as much as possible, and that if you go back on it, it will have consequences with regard to the cost. Okay, so then the next step is the design and artwork stage. This is a really iterative process of sort of going back and forth with the design agency to produce the final artwork. And we try and encourage researchers and communication staff alike to feed back on the designs through answering kind of 4 different questions. So firstly, is the infographic truthful? In other words, is it accurate? Is it conveying the message we want it to? Secondly, is it meaningful? Does it say something new or interesting that we think will be of interest to our target audiences? 3, is it useful to those target audiences? And finally, just does it look good? And in theory, really it should only be the communication staff who comment on that 4th and final point, but that's not always the case. And I think this leads on to the challenge number 6, which is that these are really subjective concepts. And because they're subjective, and because every individual will have their own point of view, this can quite often lead to a really high number of rounds of revision. So I guess the learning from this stage in the process is that it really helps to have one central point within your organisation who is responsible for collating all the feedback from all the different people who need to review the infographic, make sure that they're checking the feedback to see if there are any inconsistencies, any flat out, complete opposite sort of disagreements between the different stakeholders, and that therefore that is fed back to the designer in kind of the one go, and it's as clear as it should be.
And another thing, because obviously these are subjective concepts, but you want to try and make them as objective as possible. So one thing that we've done recently is to put together kind of infographic guidelines and try to disseminate our branding guidelines across the organisation much more widely as well, because the does it look good is subjective, but there should really be one person responsible for making sure that it looks good and is within the branding guidelines. And that could be, you know, an in-house designer, it could be the person responsible for the brand. And obviously the other things are trickier as well, but you can try to get around that as much as possible by having, you know, that sort of that how-to, or, you know, kind of guidelines on this is and is not an infographic, this is, you know, a good way of conveying a message, and this doesn't work. And having all of that kind of set down, you know, on paper and communicated to people beforehand can sort of start to make this whole process a lot easier.
Yeah. Okay, so this moves us on to the next challenge, which is the quality of artwork. And as I've mentioned, we're now working with quite a small group of really trusted suppliers when it comes to the design agencies we work with. But over the last 2 years, we've worked with a really broad range of different agencies, different freelancers, and I think that generally the quality of the artwork that we've received has been really high. But it has certainly been mixed with regard to how on brand it is, and you can certainly tell when you look at the whole suite of infographics we've developed that there are real differences in style and tone throughout, and you really need to be careful here. So this is an example of an infographic that we produced for our Sierra Leone case study, this was pre-Ebola, looking at the amazing achievements it's made in reducing neglected tropical diseases in the country. So the left-hand infographic, the pill packet, showcases how the country has managed to treat over 5 million of the country's 6 million inhabitants every year for the past 4 years for the country's most prevalent neglected tropical diseases. And the clipboard on the right shows some of the impacts that treatment has had. So you can see that elephantiasis declined between 2007 and 2011 by a huge 90%. Now, we really struggled to begin with. When we first started to produce these infographics, we were trying to think about how we could visually depict these neglected tropical diseases. And in the end, the approach we've taken is to focus on visuals which depict the treatment of those diseases, the pill packet, the clipboard, rather than the illnesses themselves. But you really need to think through quite carefully the visual approach you're going to take to make sure that it's done with sensitivity, that you're not reinforcing stereotypes. Certainly if you're including kind of figures, that you're including, if appropriate, sort of men and women, people of different ethnicities, and so forth. So really take care when you're thinking through your visuals that they're emphasizing what you want them to. Okay, and then challenge number 8 is this question of complexity versus simplicity. The infographic that you can see on your screen at the moment is one that we produced for our Nepal case study, which is trying to show the drivers of progress in the country in relation to maternal mortality. So Nepal managed to halve its maternal mortality ratio in under 15 years. And the story of how it achieved that was told through about sort of 20 odd pages in this very thick and dense research report. And we wanted to highlight it more simply and more clearly. It took us a long time. This was one of the very first infographics we produced. And it took us quite a long time to agree between the researchers and the communication staff how many factors to include. I think if you looked and read the actual report, you'd probably find about 50 different factors are mentioned in terms of what led to Nepal being able to reduce maternal mortality to the extent it has. And it was quite a challenge to agree which ones should be featured in the infographic, because you don't want to completely overwhelm people with information, but at the same time you don't want to just give a partial picture of the progress that has been achieved and give a misleading picture of that progress because people think it just took 3 or 4 factors to achieve the progress it did. So I will leave you to be the judge of how successful this has been. I think there is still far too much information in there. Certainly if we were looking to communicate this over social media, it would be very difficult unless we took particular elements of it. But we've also had really good feedback from policymakers and others, both working in Nepal, but also more broadly in the health sector, that this has been really useful and helpful for them to help them sort of see the factors at a glance. And just to say on this, I'm just going to quote my ex-colleague Jonathan Tanner, who said, you know, our job as communication specialists isn't to simplify or to dumb down, it's to prioritize. And I think we need to keep coming back to that. We're not aiming to try to say that, you know, it was down to 3 or 4 factors that Nepal managed to reduce its mortality rate, but rather that these 3 or 4 are the most important.
And yeah, I definitely echo that. And on this one, we within ODI have produced a few of this kind of thing now, where you've actually got quite a lot of information. So it's not just one kind of highlight from the report or one particular sort of killer stat. It's, you know, trying to tell a bit more of the whole story and, you know, kind of all the messages and all the findings. But you can do so in a way, and that's what we try to do, which, you know, gives you the whole picture, but where you can pick out sort of smaller elements, you know, in kind of different segments, and you can kind of take those as standalone stats as well and use those to share on social media or do other kind of comms activities with. So there's definitely like an approach here which is proving quite successful, where you've got the bigger picture but you can zoom in on different segments of it to sort of pick out the highlights and the really killer stats.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so moving on, the next step in the process is that we try and get an external opinion. So where possible, we will try to find someone representative of our target audience to see what they think of the infographics. Sometimes it can just be my mom if I'm trying to reach out to the general public. Other times it might be a specialist in a particular sector, but it's really, really worth trying to canvass the opinion of your target audience. Although it can also leave you with a challenge of if you encounter different interpretations of the infographic, what you then do at that stage, given that you've invested a lot of time and money to date in producing the infographic. It can be hard to completely change your approach if you don't get the response that you were looking for from your target audience. And then just to echo what we were saying earlier, the challenge at this point is just the sheer number of people involved. I originally gave this presentation at the Cartagena Data Festival as part of a broader event on infographics. And one of the questions I was asked was what's the least number of people you think it takes to produce an infographic? And I think I said in that meeting, oh, I think about 3 or 4. But I would revise that opinion to say you can just do it with one person, but you need to have that one person wearing different hats. So you need to have somebody who's a data specialist or researcher who really knows the data and can make sure that the infographic is accurate and is conveying a truthful message. You need a designer, somebody who knows good design principles. You might need a developer if you're going to produce an interactive infographic or data visualization. And you definitely need somebody wearing the hat of a communication specialist, so somebody who's going to think about that target audience all the way through the process and make sure that what you deliver is something that they need or are looking for or are interested in. And related to this, you need to make sure you've got the funds. And I don't think, I mean, certainly the infographics that we've been showing you to date have required a significant investment, and I'm not going to try and hide that. But I think there are things that you can do. There are some free tools out there that mean you don't necessarily have to have the biggest budget.
Yeah, so we actually, because we have an in-house designer, we haven't really used these free tools, but there are some out there like Infogram and Pictochart and Canva and Tableau, which I already mentioned, which is better for doing the kind of more complicated stuff with data sets, and if you want it to be sort of interactive and with users able to manipulate that data. But I would say if you don't have a massive budget, at least to start off with, or any budget rather, I would probably recommend focusing on, basically focusing on the data. So looking at what you've got, and if the easiest way to convey that is, with a simple Excel chart, then that can often be the way to go. And I'll show you an example of that in a few slides' time.
Okay, so moving on, step 7 is...
We've had some questions. So sorry, Katie. Just on the software, we've had some questions on that. So I think, Pia, you just listed them out. So you said Infogram and Pictochart are good. What was the third one you mentioned?
The third one is called Canva. These are all ones that I haven't used them here at ODI, but I checked in with our designer and she said that these are all sort of decent free tools. And the final one is Tableau,
right?
Which can be, I think, has a free element as well.
And Tableau, you said, is better for the interactive infographics.
Exactly. If you've got a lot of data and you want people to be able to, you either want to kind of produce different views of that data, but also allow users to maybe manipulate it or kind of click to see different views of it themselves, that's probably the one to start with.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, we've just listed, yeah, we just had some questions to repeat the names of the software. So I think we've done that now. Maybe what we can do as well is when we send around the recording, we can give the colleagues some hyperlinks to these different software.
Yeah, definitely.
Because as you said, I think most of them are available in free version or upgraded version, so you can kind of play around with them for free without purchasing.
And I'll send a couple of examples as well of how we have, or how some of our different programs have used Tableau to do that kind of more interactive data thing.
Okay, great. Sorry for the interruption. Go ahead.
No, not at all.
I hope you have as many steps as you have challenges.
I think we do. I think we do.
I'm joking.
Okay, so whittling through kind of towards the end of this process, and then we'll just feed back a little bit on the impact of some of the infographics that we've produced. So step 7 is kind of signing off the infographic and then promoting it, which often you can kind of forget about promoting it until you actually have the shiny, lovely infographic in front of you. But actually, it's kind of the most important part, because you can spend a significant amount of money producing a lovely infographic, but if no one gets to see it, then it's basically been a pointless endeavor. One of the challenges here is, even though you've kind of really clearly tried to define your aims at the start, what you want your infographic to achieve, suddenly everybody wants it to achieve everything. And this we find with every single infographic we produce. So people want it to be put in the research report, people want to use it in PowerPoint presentations, they want to share it, elements of it on social media, you name it. And that's fine if you've thought about that from the outset and you've produced different versions of it, and you've got the little social media share icons, you've got the full infographic to put in the case study report. But it can be quite tricky to handle if at this stage you're really radically changing what you want the infographic to do from what you decided at the outset. And quite often there'll be differences in opinions around what those audiences should do having seen your infographic, so what action they should take. And quite often with researchers, they would respond that they would want people to actually read the research, that an infographic draws them in, they get a deeper understanding of the topic through reading the case study in full. Whereas communication colleagues might put more of an emphasis on sharing the research, sharing the infographics, sharing the key findings, so that the research gets a wider reach. And they don't have to be mutually exclusive, but your communication strategy, your promotional strategy might differ depending on which one of those two approaches you go for. So it's best to be as clear about that as possible. So just from development progress from our point of view, some of the things we've learned along the way. I mean, none of this is particularly revolutionary, but just that, I don't think there is such a thing as a quick win. You have to be prepared to put in the time and the effort. Having said that, though, as you'll see in a minute from Pia, the simplest of Excel charts can sometimes be enough to get the job done. So be really clear about the aim of your infographic and kind of follow on from there and adapt the process accordingly. Make sure you have really clear roles and responsibilities so everyone is aware of what role they're going to play in the process. Make sure they have enough time, really practically time in their diaries to commit to the process from start to end. Make sure you're working with trusted suppliers, build up a good relationship, you'll need it, and really take time to talk. I don't think it's the sort of thing that can happen over email. You need to get people in a room. You need to see sort of where the different opinions are coming from, how different people are approaching the infographics, and so it just talk rather than trying to do it over email is something I would really encourage you to do. But I would say it's worth it. I've really focused this presentation on kind of some of the challenges we've gone through, because I thought that would be helpful to share in case any of you guys are going through similar things. But I'd say there's really clear evidence that producing infographics have really increased the uptake of our research. So a couple of examples, the infographics on the right are taken from our Mongolia report, looking at how Mongolia has increased and improved school attendance and university attendance in the country. We ran this infographic, and then we also produced some photographs of nomadic education in Mongolia, and we got in touch with Upworthy, and they really loved the photos, but they, to be honest, weren't particularly interested until we showed them the infographics, and they were like, "Oh, these tell the story," and they packaged them all up in a really lovely report. And I mean, to give you a sense, Upworthy, I mean, according to their website, engage about 50 million people each month. So, I mean, those are the sorts of engagement figures we can only dream of in development progress. So getting a gatekeeper kind of news organisation such as Upworthy on board was fantastic, and I'm not sure would have been done without the infographics. We produced a whole series of animations. The first in that series has had over 19,000 views. Again, those sorts of viewing rates are just uncomparable for other things we produced at ODI, so it's clearly working. But also the infographics have been used in all kinds of ways that we couldn't foresee at the outset, including at presentations that our researchers are given at events, and also to increase the number of shares in social media. And we've had really positive kind of anecdotal feedback from policymakers about their impact.
Okay, and so now I'm just going to obviously echo everything that Katie has already said, but add a few more of my top tips just from doing infographics at ODI. So number one, don't be afraid to say that not everything should be an infographic. So quite often, you know, especially if you've seen some quite cool infographics online, you sort of get the idea that that's what you want to do before you've actually identified the message and the audience and worked out whether an infographic is the right tool for that particular message. So just make sure that you're thinking about that at the start. A stitch in time saves 9. So again, just echoing the point that it's really important to get the messaging agreed at the outset, so that you're not going back and forth over it when the designs have already been produced and you're kind of too far down that path. Don't cut corners, so it can be tempting to kind of just send some numbers through and some rough ideas through to a designer, and that actually especially applies if you've got an in-house designer. But you'll save yourself lots of time and probably money if you write a clear brief with all of the text and the copy agreed and signed off as much as possible beforehand. Another one, which obviously isn't as simple as it sounds, but get buy-in. So it is really important to sort of be, in most organisations anyway, to be that sort of champion for infographics and make the case internally that making a message more accessible isn't the same as dumbing down. And another really important thing, which we're trying to do more and more precisely to help with that kind of buy-in process, is to show results. So we now send around a kind of weekly sort of summary of what's done really well in terms of our online communications, and that helps to sort of let people know how the infographics and other comms outputs that we're producing are actually making a difference. Another point is obviously establish a process. So once you have started doing infographics and want to do so regularly, you can iron out a lot of those challenges that you see every single time by putting a clear process in place and then making sure that everyone who's involved in infographics, from researchers to comm staff, know about the process. So these are a couple of screen grabs from the infographics guidelines that we've just produced, which we're now sort of trying to spread throughout ODI. So these are just a couple of slides, but we've got the sort of types of data visualization that people might want to produce, a kind of flow chart of the process, making it really clear who's involved, who needs to be signing off and who needs to be taking part at each stage. Another thing which I've found really important is test your assumptions. So experiment with different formats. Infographics are a good and fun thing to experiment with. And I've actually found that the thing that I thought would work best and be shared most on social media hasn't been. So the first example on the left is this kind of narrative style one-page infographic, and this is about a report that we released a couple of months ago about development finance, and this one-pager really does try to kind of sum up all of the key messages of the report and put some of those key figures in there. And it ends with 5 recommendations for the Addis Summit next month. And I sort of imagined that might be a bit sort of complicated for people to digest and share a lot on social media, which is why we also produced a bunch of these comparison stats. So, for example, this healthcare one next to it. But what we actually found when we, disseminated these and posted them to social media is that by far the most successful one was this narrative infographic. And, we wouldn't have done that without producing both types and just seeing what worked. Another one which I really thought would work a lot better than it did was this animated GIF at the bottom about the cost of a healthy diet versus the cost of a unhealthy diet. And again, it was just an experiment, but I was kind of surprised because I love animated GIFs, that not everyone else loved our animated GIFs as much as we did. And in fact, it was the more narrative style infographic that did a lot better than this one. And the next one, the second to last one, I think, is so creating the infographic, as Katie mentioned, is really actually just the beginning of the process. So dissemination is equally important, and making sure that you're targeting, influencers and the people that you want to be reading and sharing this infographic. And this is my favorite example from ODI. So the narrative infographic that I just showed you, if you look at the graph along the bottom, you can see, well, you can't see all the numbers, but basically it didn't get more than 100 views on our website on any particular day. And then one day Bill Gates tweeted about it and our page views rocketed up to just over 4,000 and then went back down again. So that's the kind of impact that making sure that your infographics are being picked up by people with tons of Twitter followers or influencers in your sector can have. And the final thing is, we've talked a lot about the whole sort of process of planning an infographic and going through all these quite complex steps and making sure that lots of people are involved, which is what we would always do or try to do when we've got a big report coming out that we're trying to, develop a comm strategy around. But at the same time, it is important to look for opportunities to be reactive, and it may not even be your own data that you're producing. And here are 2 examples of things that worked quite well for us. So the first one is our director tweeting a chart that one of our researchers produced, where he basically, we didn't have any research coming out on Ebola, but it was, the topic in the news for that time. And he quickly investigated how much different countries were putting in and knocked up a quick table, and that did really well for us. And when you look at the fact that it's just a very basic Excel graph with no branding or design whatsoever, that kind of just backs up that point that I made earlier, which is really it is about the data and the story you're trying to tell over and above any sort of any design. And the last one is just an example of something we produced around the Nepal earthquake, where again we didn't have any new research coming out at that time, but we wanted to highlight some of the humanitarian challenges of getting assistance into people in Nepal. So this is just something that the humanitarian policy group here at ODI put together very quickly. And again, it's just something that, because it's very timely and because the information is interesting and valuable to people, it got a lot of shares. And that's my final point. So that's that.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. This has been really fascinating, and I'm so thankful for your honesty in walking through what it's like to have so many different people in the room with an opinion, and what you thought would work, which ended up not working. And it's just really valuable the way you share your story. So thank you for that. Let's go now to questions. We have a lot of questions about whether or not the presentation will be shared. A colleague in Belarus, Daria, who wants to show it to her colleagues there. Questions on the recording of the webinar. We will record the webinar, and if it's okay with you guys, and you can share the presentation with us, along with some links on the software, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We have a specific question from Guadalupe Casas, who's asking, what do you think are the most successful dissemination channels? Apologies. What are the most successful dissemination channels and platforms for your infographics?
I would say, it depends on your audience. So sometimes the research that we produce is targeted at a very specific small group of decision makers or policy makers on a very particular issue. And it depends what opportunities you have to reach them. So for some of our infographics, simply putting them in a presentation that researcher was giving to that group of people has proven really effective, because it's allowed the researchers to talk through the issues and kind of prioritize the main findings in a visually attractive, clear and accessible way. So sometimes I would say just, presenting them at relevant conferences and events and forums and meetings has been really successful. I would say social media like Twitter, absolutely vital for increasing the breadth of your audience, getting it out to potentially new people. We don't produce infographics for all of our research, but we certainly see a big increase in the number of retweets and shares when we do produce an infographic than when we don't. So I think social media is absolutely key. We've also just tried, quite often our researchers will go and have one-to-one meetings with policymakers. They will quite often take along a copy of the report, and we've often tried just professionally printing on one page the infographics on top and handing it over alongside the report. And I find that we've had quite a lot of anecdotal but really positive feedback on, in terms of just providing that particular policymaker with the main headline findings without them having to read that 40-page report.
Exactly. Yeah, we've had exactly the same for a lot of ODI's infographics. And I think one more channel is just thinking about media and making the infographics part of a media package and part of your media outreach that you're doing. And what we've had more and more, I think, is, for example, when our media colleagues are pitching stories into newspapers and other websites, that they are able to, provide either the infographics or sometimes the raw data. And, we've had papers like the Financial Times, the Guardian, the Economist, take those and actually create their own infographics out of them, but often having seen some ones produced by us in the first place before they do their own versions. And we've also sometimes, there are lots of websites and blogs and papers that really like visual content, and they don't, and they like getting it from other people because it means they don't have to produce it. So I mean, we have yet to get on BuzzFeed. I think that's one of my aims. But recently with our with those animated GIFs that I showed you a second ago about food prices. We made it onto the Daily Mail website, which I don't know if everyone knows, but it's a very kind of right-wing tabloid, actually quite anti-development a lot of the time, newspaper. But anyway, they really liked our infographics and put a story together based on those. And so that's just an example of how, if you're providing that early enough, and you do need to have it, a good week or two before, say, you're launching some research, so that it can be part of the package that people are pitching to journalists. But that can be a really valuable way, and often, media will cover it in different ways, and you'll get some that will cover, write a report, and you'll get some that will simply use your infographics. So it's good to cater to all of them.
Excellent. Thanks so much. It's a good measure of progress to see your work in papers that you wouldn't normally consider among your key audiences. Right? Certainly. Yeah. So we've got some questions here from Carlos Munoz, who is in Rome. I'm guessing at one of the food-based agencies, WFP or FAO, but I'm not sure. So Carlos is asking about visual comparisons, and when you're doing infographics of visual comparisons, how precise should the sizing be? Is this a science or an art or somewhere in between?
So I would say that's something that any good designer should be able to do, and certainly our in-house designer does. So if you're doing something like, you know, this is a quarter of that, and you're showing maybe 2 circles, they should be in proportion, you know, to a reasonable degree.
Yeah, we place a lot of emphasis on the accuracy of that, because otherwise it's misleading. But any good design agency should be able to, you know, should have the tools and packages to be able to produce those comparative visualizations with I would say, quite a high degree of accuracy.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So I think that that concludes the questions that we have in the chat box at the moment. So just to clarify, Carlos is from the World Food Program. I was guessing, okay. Since he's in Rome. So maybe let me just, while we're waiting for some more questions, we'll give a couple more minutes to see if anything pops up. Let me iterate what I think are maybe a few takeaway messages from what I've heard you say. And these are just subjective, what's fallen on my frame of reference, but let me offer them here while we call for more questions in the chat box if there are some. So first, I think you've really pointed out how important it is to know your audience, and I love your subcategories of audiences. I hope we in the UN are among the movers and shakers.
Definitely.
But we'll take being part of the country catalysts or the raconteurs as well. So I think that's really key. And then I like the way you talk about, you know, not only knowing your audience, but then canvassing them to test out the infographics. Even if, as you said, Katie, if you're looking for general public, even if it's your mom who you're canvassing it with before you release it. And then finally, also knowing what you want your audience to do. If you just want them to read the report, if you want them to take action, this is, I think, really important for us. The second thing I think that really struck me was this, you know, choice of the starting point, right? It's either starting with the data or starting with the narrative. And you really highlighted the dangers of both approaches to beware of. Of course, starting with the data could mean you have a very complex story to tell. Starting with the narrative could mean you're bending the data to tell the story that you do want to tell. But it's very important, I think, to make those explicit from the start. I think that's really useful. And then you've also kind of dispelled some myths, I think, about infographics, which I thought were really useful. One myth would be, you know, this is too simplistic to influence policymakers. And it sounds like from your experience, actually, no. That's not the case at all. That in fact, probably policymakers appreciate, you know, a more simplified look at things. I like the way, Pia, you said, making a message accessible isn't the same as dumbing it down. So that I thought was very useful. And then on the other extreme, there can be a myth that, you know, infographics, particularly the causal ones, the ones that tell a story, the ones that give a lot of information, can be too complex for the media, which your Upworthy story about the infographic on education in Mongolia really, you know, shows us that that's not always the case as well. That instead of just being interested in the photojournalism, once they saw the infographic, they said, "Oh wow, now this is really something."
And just to Gina, just to come in on that, I mean, there's a whole pile of evidence that's emerging from Bond and ODI and the others in the UK, but I'm sure would apply to other countries as well, which show that the broader public have an appetite for stories of change, for more complex, more nuanced and understanding and depiction of how development is happening. And I think that there is a misconception that infographics are all about, you know, they need to just be showing one stat or they need to be super simple. Yes, in some, you know, for some purposes, such as sharing on social media, it helps to have, you know, something that can be easily understood in quite a small area, and you may want to just focus on 1 or 2 stats. But I think infographics have a really important role to play in helping tell that more complex but accessible story of how change is happening.
Excellent, thank you. So my strategy proved effective, and we do have one more question coming in from Nairobi. Dunstan Ondachi works with the regional UNDG for Eastern and Southern Africa. So he is asking, does an infographic have to have a symbolic logic?
Oh.
Dunstan, if you want to add anything to that, go ahead and put it in the chat box, and we can supplement your question. But sorry, please go ahead.
I mean, it has to be logical, I would say. I mean, every infographic, I suppose, is metaphorical in a sense, because you're using imagery or comparisons or whatever it is to depict normally a statistic or something in text-based form. I guess I don't know how else to answer that question. Maybe I can think about it, and then we can kind of send around a response when we circulate the presentation.
Sounds good. Sounds very good. All right then. So if Peter, you have a question, please.
Okay, if I may jump in, I was manning the chat box a moment ago, so
please do.
So if I miss this from your presentation, please forgive me. But you know, I'm just wondering. I think what for me also resonates is that you know, finding your storyline in the 50-page report that you've been handed is incredibly important when creating an infographic. And I actually worked as a journalist before, so I have had some experience in taking, you know, massive information and finding what the angle is, which I think is important also when you're creating an infographic. But I'm wondering, for people for whom this might be new, whether you might be able to provide some tips or techniques for, okay, you've just been handed a 50-page report, you know, on, let's say, food security in Central Asia. How do you, what sort of like thinking processes, or how do you actually go from taking the report to and culling a narrative that's suitable for an infographic?
I think it's a really good question, and yeah, I think the strength of your infographic will ultimately depend on the strength of that angle, that message, that hook that it rests on. From my point of view, I certainly read all of the research reports at an early stage and think through then what I think. You know, I start that process of thinking, oh, I wonder what could be interesting here to visualize in an infographic. But I find it incredibly difficult to sometimes to find that in a 50-page report. My preferred option is to, if the researcher has time, have literally a 15-minute chat where I will almost play the role of a journalist, and I will ask them, you know, tell me about the research, tell me about what you find interesting. Tell me, you know, if you were going to talk to somebody in the local pub tonight about this report, what would you say to them? And sometimes it's clear, it's the main message in a report that is the most interesting thing. But sometimes it can be a fact that's hidden on page 38, and they just happen to mention it, and you think, oh, that's new, that's counterintuitive, that's contrary to what I thought before, that could be interesting to highlight. So from my point of view, I would say, if you can at all, sit down, have a conversation with the researcher and be the journalist and find the story that way.
Yeah, and on my side, I mean, I have a few different strategies. I quite often will try, if I can, to wait for my media colleague to actually draft a press release, because I find that invaluable, because of what they'll often do is pull out those key messages, and then, you know, I know once that's signed off, I obviously know what I can be focusing on and using for the infographic. But if the timing doesn't allow that, then I normally kind of comb through the report, looking for, you know, facts, stats that, you know, might be a bit buried, as Katie said. If the report already has figures and graphs that are in there, then looking at whether I can take any of those and maybe just adapt them for social media if the message is kind of strong and would work as a standalone infographic. And then quite often what I do end up doing is, just write the infographic, especially if it's a kind of narrative style one. I just try to look at the executive summary and look through the report at the different sections and the key recommendations. And I write kind of almost like a script for a narrative infographic. I break up the information and I sort of suggest how different parts of it could be visualized. And then I send that to the researchers and wait for them to tell me I've taken completely the wrong angle and it needs a totally different emphasis. Because very often the only way that you'll provoke colleagues to give you sort of the feedback is to give them something that they don't like, and then they have to turn around and tell you what they do like.
Exactly. It's always easier to know what you didn't want once you see it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which makes the job much harder. So we do have another question here from Alain Kofana. The question is about the culture factor. So what do you do about the cultural influence of people targeted by an infographic to understand it as we want? Because symbols can have different signification depending on the culture or the region.
So I think that's where Katie's point about kind of almost user testing it before you finalize it on your target audiences is really important, because we're based in London, and there will always be sort of visual signifiers that we hadn't realized were sensitive or inappropriate, or maybe colors even that aren't quite right and maybe convey a different message. So you can try to mitigate that as much as possible by sort of just thinking properly about it as you're doing the designs. And one thing that we've done as part of our infographics guidelines and kind of toolkit is to have some set icons that we use to symbolize education or sanitation that are hopefully quite universally well understood. But inevitably there will be things that you don't spot or haven't anticipated or just didn't know. And that's where, particularly if, say, it's one of these country case studies, or if you do want it to be shared by quite a range of people in different countries, make sure that you run it by people in those countries, and they can flag anything that you might not have noticed.
I guess, given the nature of kind of social media, and that anybody, things spread beyond your control, and people see it that you would never have expected to. You can't always control for every single interpretation of your graphics. I know we've faced quite a range of very vocal views on some of our infographics that featured women wearing the veil, and those infographics were produced for countries where some women in that country do wear the veil and others don't, and we tried to reflect that in our infographics. But others took offence at that and said, actually, I don't think we should be depicting women wearing the veil. And I think, in those circumstances, my best advice would be to just engage with those people in conversation. Don't try and shut it down. Don't try to suppress those reactions and those comments. Have an open and honest debate and say, look, these relate to much bigger debates than just our infographics, and engage in those conversations. But ultimately, you can't foresee or try to control every single interpretation of your graphics. And I think as well that fear can often be what puts people off from developing infographics. And I would say that of all of the graphics that we've produced, you could count on one hand the sort of the negative reactions we've got. So I think don't overplay those risks. Be mindful, be sensitive when you're producing them, but don't let that kind of stop you from producing them in the first place.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point, because a lot of this is about using sort of what we can assume are generic icons, right, to trigger something in people's minds, but we can't go so far into questioning interpretations that we don't produce anything. I know now there's an effort to develop simple graphics for each of the proposed 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which member states will agree upon in September, and that's been a really challenging process as well, because we're talking about, again, complex ideas like sustainable consumption and production, which it's very hard to have one visual and one hashtag for.
Yeah, I wouldn't like to be that designer task.
And you can only imagine how many people are in the room advising on whether or not it looks good.
Yeah.
It's many more than 6 or 7. So we've got one last question from Anna, which I think we'll cover by sending round the presentation. She says, is it possible to have a copy of the infographics guidelines? I think those are within the presentation, if I'm right. So we'll...
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll just make a version. I think a lot of it is quite internal, which is why I didn't show the whole thing, but I'll definitely be able to send a version without all of our unnecessary internal ODI stuff as well, so that's fine.
Excellent. All right, well, if there are no... this always happens in a webinar. The second you start to say if there are no further questions, one pops up. Okay, this is a question on maps can work well if interactive, but what about static maps? Have not seen many in your presentation. Do you have any experiences?
Yeah, I think maps are better if they can be interactive and you can zoom in and you can sort of highlight different layers or draw out different features if they are interactive. I'm just trying to think. I think we have used static maps as part of our infographics, but really, I think more often than not to show sort of different sizes and comparisons, we might use the outline of the country for that. I'm just trying to look up here to see whether...
Yeah, no, we definitely have used static maps, maps in various bits of research that we've done. Another thing that, another tool that I've used actually, which I don't know whether to call it an infographic tool, but it's called Mapbox, and again, that's free up to a certain number of views of your map, and we've used that to sort of illustrate when we've got, for example, case studies from lots of different countries or activities happening in lots of different countries, and it's basically like a map tool which you can drop pins in and add links and text and information to each pin. So we've used that in quite a few places on our website, and that is interactive. So yeah, I would recommend using that tool as well. Yeah, I don't know. We don't have anything against maps. We just have a use of Mapbox. Yeah, exactly.
Box.
Yeah, we tend to use kind of actual maps in our reports to highlight different areas where we've done case study research or using the actual maps, and then we tend to use more kind of symbolic representations, perhaps of the outline of a country in our infographics to show the scale of something or the size of something. But yeah, I'd be really keen to know, to see other examples of anybody using maps in kind of more innovative ways in their infographics. That would be a cool thing to see.
Excellent. All right. Thank you guys so much. So let me close out this webinar just by saying thank you to everyone online. I think we have about 55 people online. We don't know how many countries, but many UN agencies and representing a wide spectrum of people who are interested in infographics, and I'm sure that they've all learned a lot about, from, as I said, the honest way that you've told this story. Huge thanks for this to both Katie Harris and Pia Dawson. Thank you guys really so much. You have a wealth of experience, and your generosity is really inspiring in the way you share it.
Not at all, and thank you, Gina, for the opportunity to do the webinar. And we just really hoped that by being open and honest and upfront about some of the challenges in the process, we can hopefully give others a sense that they're not alone if they're going through similar challenges, and also sort of work together more as a sector to try and overcome some of these. And it certainly is possible.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we've got your emails up on the screen. So we'll copy you in when we send out the recording and the presentation and some of these suggestions on software. Huge thanks to you both. I know we took up the better part of your afternoon, but it's been really useful for us. Very useful.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
thanks to everyone for listening.
Thanks again. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.